Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the New Mexico Museum of Art and to this evening's lecture by Dr. Cristina Cruz Gonzalez, presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Saints and Santos, Picturing the Holy in New Spain, for which she served as guest curator. We appreciate you all coming out on a night that threatens rain. New Mexicans say they love the rain, and yet nobody ever wants to get out in it. So we appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I think you're going to be in for a real treat with this lecture. My name is Mark White. I'm the executive director here at the museum. The New Mexico Museum of Art sits on unceded ancestral Tewa land, specifically Ogopoge, now present-day Santa Fe. Dr. Gonzalez is an associate professor of art history at Oklahoma State University. She's an art historian of the early modern Spanish world, which dates roughly from 1500 to 1850, with a specialty in the arts of Spanish America. She earned her PhD from the University of Chicago, a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and a Master of Arts from the University of Texas at Austin. Her recent scholarship includes contributions to cultural convergence in New Mexico, interactions in art, history and archaeology honoring William Roth, and aesthetic theology in the Franciscan tradition, the senses, and the experience of God in art. In 2022, we asked Dr. Gonzalez to serve as guest curator for the exhibition Saints and Santos. The exhibition proved to be an ambitious undertaking, drawn from museum and private collections across Mexico and the United States. Those of you that have seen the exhibition, I know, would probably agree this was a fantastic project. The exhibition is really a stellar project. And if you have not seen it, I encourage you to do so tomorrow. Unfortunately, the galleries are closed for the evening, but it is, or will be closed by probably the time we conclude. But I assure you, it is really an amazing show, and it was certainly worth all of the efforts that Dr. Gonzalez and the museum put into it. I should also say that Dr. Gonzalez organized tomorrow's symposium, which will feature 7 distinguished scholars from around the country who will discuss various topics related to the exhibition. I would also like to mention that on November 1st, which is All Saints Day, we will be hosting a lecture from Professor Gavin Bailey, the Alfred and Isabel Botter Professor of Southern Baroque Art at Queen's University, Canada, who will be speaking on Catholic religious orders and the promotion of saints in New Spain. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cristina Cruz Gonzalez.
Thank you. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Mark, and thank you to your museum for allowing me to basically create a show I've been dreaming about, thinking about, really just something I've been investigating and exploring on so many different levels, from a student to a professor to, a museum consultant. Finally, right, has come to fruition. But it's not only that, it's also that it's happening here. At this museum, look at this auditorium, right? We're in our space, we're in our home, basically. But also Santa Fe, as part of that trail that went from Mexico City to the north, the Silver Route, so-called Silver Route, had a terminus here. And so this is not tangential to the story I'm telling. In fact, part of the story I'm telling is that this is central, actually, to how we think about saints and sanctity and the construction of these charismatic figures that communities still worship today. Santa Fe and New Mexico at large is also very apropos because I am regularly visiting it, and because the communities here have opened their homes, opened their churches, opened their collections to me, and this project would have been impossible, basically, without those scholars, faculty, students, curators, mayordomos, everyone. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. I'm going to separate the lecture into 2 parts. And the first part will be a kind of brief historical overview of sanctity and what we mean by that, and how we basically study that field. And I'll end that part with some takeaway questions, 3 questions or 3 kind of positions that give us an idea of the state of the field. For the front row here, those will be action items. That's your homework. Because I feel like even though sanctity is like this, topic that has been approached and interrogated from so many different points of view, there are still vital questions we need to ask ourselves, including where we look for it as scholars. What archives are we using, and how could we broaden those archives? So after that portion of my talk, I will give a very brief overview of the exhibition in the next room. So hopefully some of you have seen the show, or all of you have seen the show, and if you haven't, like Mark said, I hope you do see it. And this will be a kind of primer for you, and I think you will enjoy it all the more after tonight's lecture. I want to thank the museum, the New Mexico Museum of Art. I want to thank the state of New Mexico, the Toma Foundation, of course, for making this event possible, for bringing a fantastic group of scholars out here to kind of illuminate the theme a little bit better than objects can on their own, and to inspire us as well. I want to thank the speakers for taking up my invitation. It's a very busy time in the semester for all of us, so thank you for coming away from all of your obligations and your duties. I want to thank my husband, who's an associate dean and is especially busy at his university, for not only coming here tonight, but also for basically suffering the consequences of someone who's a workaholic for the last 2 years. And doing it with no complaint and helping me, in fact. Thank you so much, Andrew. Okay, we'll begin with a quotation, and it's a quotation by Peter Brown. Peter Brown is a major scholar of late antiquity and the early Christian world, recently retired from Princeton. He opened his landmark study. This is the first book he wrote after grad school, and it's called The Cult of the Saints, Its Rise and Function in Late Christianity. And he opened it, the very first line, with the announcement. This book is about the joining of heaven and earth and the role in this joining of dead human beings, end quote. So this exhibition and my talk tonight similarly is filled with exceptional figures who not only inhabit the in-between, the intersection of the sacred and the profane, but who bridge these two realms. They levitated, healed, suffered, and traveled the ends of the earth for their faith, with some dying in the process. Peter Brown focused on an early Christian landscape, which is why I have this beautiful 13th century casket up here that once held relics. And the remarkable changes that took place in the 2nd century through the early medieval period, when charismatics emerged as holy men and faithful expressed a desire for a material piety in the form of relics, healing objects, magical incantations, and organized pilgrimages in order to achieve it. So if you are interested in the subject of sanctity, this is your starting point, and that is the book. If you are an early modernist, and this is some of the material that comes from that medieval period, St. Francis, of course, in the center, very apropos for where we're at tonight, St. Sebastian on the right, St. Catherine of Alexandria on the left from a medieval manuscript. So if you're an early modernist, again, the period we're talking about is 1500 to about 1800 or 1850. If you're a Latin American early modernist, if you're a European early modernist, you usually tend to end at a little bit earlier, in about 1750. The period you would be kind of focused on begins with Trent. Essentially. The Council of Trent is essential to understanding the kinds of changes that happen with the construction and reorganization of sanctity, and its effects are still felt today. So this is an etching and an engraving that is showing us the gathering of these church leaders. They're bishops, they're canons, they're archbishops from all over the world, mostly in Europe, but there are figures that traveled, in fact, from colonial Mexico to Trent in order to attend this council. It lasted many years, and there were many discussions. So I've essentialized a couple of points that are relevant for us. So Trent doesn't just take place out of the blue. There's something called the Reformation, and there are 95 theses that get tacked up to a wall that starts that movement, and it's a critique of the church. So in 1545, Pope Paul III convened a council meeting to, in a sense, answer these criticisms. It lasted until 1563, right? So people are coming and going. Some people attend some sessions, not the others. The very last session, the 25th session, is dedicated to images and relics and saints, in fact. And so what the church does is they double down that day. And they say, we understand that this is something that's been criticized by various people, but this is why images are good, and this is why we need them. So they give us a nice definition of images as being essential for a population that needs to kind of focus on something in order to venerate a prototype in the heaven. So when you are worshiping or genuflecting in front of an image of the Virgin or the saints, they say it's actually not the piece of wood or the canvas before you, but in fact, the prototype that is in the heavens, right? And so they give us this nice definition. It's also the Bible of the illiterate. This is very important. And aside from that, they also say, you know, only the right images are good. They inspire piety. The wrong images do the opposite. They inspire sin. So this is a point that I stress to my students often, that it's not only the case that Trent allows for the veneration of images and the real kind of robust energy that follows Trent and the Baroque period as we know it today, with a production of images that are going to inspire us. It's also that Trent sets a kind of platform for their censorship, for their destruction, in a sense, because it is only the right kind of image. So who will be in charge of kind of checking to see what images are kosher or not? Well, the Inquisition plays a major role in all of this as well. So it should be decorous, not inspire sin, not inspire lust. So I give you two examples. The allegory of Venus and Cupid, made first year, right, of Trent, would be no good by the end of Trent. It inspires lust. It's not inspiring piety. The image down below, produced in the Viceroyalty of Peru, is more like it. It is kosher, it sticks to the doctrine, and it inspires people, and it also converts new communities to the new faith. So there's something that happens following Trent, and that is that the Congregation of Rites, everyone's very excited by Trent, and after Trent, the Pope establishes the Congregation of Rites, and this Congregation of Rites will be in charge of delineating sanctity. And this is the first time the church has set down rules for who is a saint and who is not a saint. And this is the first time they will talk about beatification as being an essential step to sanctity. So there will be a whole process, and one must pass each hurdle or each kind of level in order to move up in the process. So this is scripted. There's no room for error. There are judges, in a sense, that's the Congregation of Rites. There will be postulators or procurators who are in charge of a cause. They're like the attorney, and they will argue the case, will be the representative for that cause. A lot of money will be spent on a cause and getting that person to the finish line, and each step was celebrated. So a beatification was a huge deal. A canonization, well, we won't say more, that's the ultimate. So everyone wants one of their own to be canonized. There's a competition amongst European nations to have more saints, right, than your neighbor across the border. Spain enters this competition and no holds barred spends a pretty penny in trying to have as many people recognized by the Vatican, by the congregation as possible. They succeed early on with San Diego de Alcalá, who is canonized following Trent in the 16th century already. But their main coup would happen a bit later, in 1622. Spain has 4 people canonized that year. There are only 5 that are canonized. So it is not only cause for major celebration, it also inspires them to emphasize sanctity even more within the Spanish Empire. So this is celebrated not only in Spain, but also in Spanish America. I'm showing you a beautiful monumental, it's humongous, engraving that's based on a drawing that was made showing the theater in Rome, in St. Peter's, when they announced the canonization and then had a celebration, the official ceremony recognizing these 5 saints. And so you say there's 4 corners, how could there be 5? So St. Ignatius, Loyola, and Francis Xavier, the 2 Jesuit co-founders, share a cartouche on the right side, upper right. And then you have St. Philip Neri on the lower right, and St. Teresa de Avila in the lower left. And then above her is San Isidro Labrador, St. Isidore, the laborer. So a couple of facts as we're looking at this stick out. One is that there are 4 Spaniards and 1 Italian. The Italians like to say that 5 people were canonized that day, but there was only 1 saint. The other fact is this, they are all Counter-Reformation saints except for San Isidro Labrador. So the rest were basically contemporary figures that were part of this early modern world and intent on reforming it in order to globalize it and make it essential again, right? And so this is going to be very important. This, what I call, or what we call Baroque sanctity, is already this kind of accepted vision of what sanctity will look like and what it should be like. The other major thing is this that Spain does, not just, they're not just trying to push their own over the borderline, they're also trying to legitimate those saints that aren't officially recognized. So medieval saints, legendary saints within Iberia that are taken to be saints by local communities, but not officially on a liturgical calendar, need to be recognized, the Vatican says. So Spain goes to work very quickly trying to look for the evidence that these are real figures, that there is historical evidence, and that they existed. The Congregation of Rites makes an exception. They say if you can't find the evidence that they existed and performed these miracles on the standard that we've just established, there's something else that you could do in order for them to officially be recognized. You could show us that they have a history of veneration of at least 200 years. So it's figures like Santa Librada, a big saint I know here in New Mexico, who get officially recognized through that channel, showing that there was veneration for those 200 years. So again, allowing for the introduction of new saints, but also for people to be purged from the official calendar. And that is a view of beautiful St. Peter's. So 1622, we imagine what the scene must have been like, right? Approaching the newly constructed St. Peter's, or reconstructed St. Peter's, with Bernini and Caravaggio and Borromini, basically these three giants that are redefining the Baroque period for us. Those columns, of course, are by Bernini out in front. We have Bernini's Saint Teresa of Avila on the right, levitating. This would have been seen. This is his kind of last chance at being accepted once again into kind of high commissions, because he had lost a little bit of his credibility for a while. And so he creates this masterpiece of Saint Teresa de Avila, levitating and suffering the transverberation when the angel pierces her in the heart with an arrow, and she is in ecstasy and feels love for Christ as intensely as is possible, supernaturally, in fact. And then on the left, a kind of example, again, that Spain is not only concentrating on new people, but wants to kind of bring these old people back into the limelight. So it's San Lorenzo, St. Lawrence. But now it's a view of St. Lawrence from a Baroque standpoint, from a vantage point, where it's much more graphic, it's much more kind of obvious how the takeaway message we're supposed to gather from this. His mode of martyrdom and suffering are made vividly explicit for all to see. This is on the main altar in the very center of the Escorial altar, right outside of Madrid. So, like I said, in New Spain, they are celebrating, as part of the Spanish Empire, these new canonizations as well. And so we have not just these saints being invoked as they are in the Jesuit college in Tepoztlán, right outside of Mexico City. That college, of course, is going to have altars dedicated to their namesake, St. Francis Xavier, but also St. Ignatius of Loyola. But New Spain is also doing something else. They're doing something different. They're working with materials and a kind of sense of materiality that is quite unique and original. And so in the center, we have San Isidro Labrador, done all in feathers, beautiful feather work. This is from the Sumaya Museum in Mexico City. And there are as many species of birds as you see colors that are part of this work. And so you have canary and you have hummingbird and different kind of species of colibri, all of it, a little bit of quetzal as well. Things that were gathered these long, vast distances. And what scholars are in agreement about is that it's not just the scene of St. Isidore that inspires us, but for an indigenous community or a Nahua community, it was the feathers themselves that were part of the program that lent this notion of the supernatural, of the miraculous, right? So St. Isidore is here basically throwing his seeds out to the field and planting and going on his merry way with his oxen, and the seeds are all falling onto the ground, onto this floor. We're looking at these quite closely now for the minuscule details that go into not just their construction, but perhaps also their meaning, the directionality, for example, of some of these feathers, the feathers from above that seem to rain down, the feathers from below that are all positioned in a certain manner, etc. There's a beautiful detail, and it's cut off here, unfortunately, but there are canary feathers that are used at the top in order to create a bird. And so that bird is on top, and it's created of feathers as well. And a couple of other examples from New Spain. In the upper right is St. Teresa of Avila receiving that transverberation and that arrow going into her heart. But here it's two angels, not just one, which is very unusual in the kind of European iconography, so there's already a shift. And the other major difference is that it's a painting on copper, and the copper has been pierced. in order to allow, literally, in order to allow a little cavity for the insertion of relics. So what it does is it transforms this work, two-dimensional, on a copper back support, into, in a sense, a three-dimensional object, right? A container for the sacred. We have to imagine that the relics echoed the saint that's being depicted. In some way were related to Saint Teresa, if not her bones, part of her habit, or even part of her signature on a piece of paper. In the lower right, you will see this work in the show. And it is St. Francis Xavier about to embark on a global mission, but it is composed of mother of pearl that's been inlaid on the surface. It is absolutely divine. You have the figures who are representing the corners of the world, and it is one central figure who's unfurling a map of Asia and pointing to China. And St. Francis Xavier, of course, is ultimately, this is his goal, to convert in mainland China. He doesn't quite reach the mainland, and he dies off the coast on an island. And so this invokes his death, his life, his global mission, and the Jesuit and Spanish global mission at this time as well. It's made in Mexico City in a workshop, the Gonzalez workshop. There's a little bit of a debate on which Gonzalez might have made it, but it also has a dedication below, and if you come back tomorrow to the show, I encourage you to read that dedication because it tells us that it's an effigy, a true portrait of the saint, and that it is dedicated in the year 1703. We know who it was made for. It lists its patrons. And this is quite important because there's hardly a work in this genre that provides so much of that information. This work hasn't been scientifically studied to the extent that others have. This past year, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's El Enconchado, which is what these objects are called, underwent a serious study with all the scientific equipment you could imagine. And what the scientists were able to determine is that the shells came from multiple places, in fact, that there were some shells that seemed certainly to come from Indonesia. There were some shells that seemed to certainly come from the Sea of Cortez. There were some shells that had microscopic perforations indicating that they might have been threaded and belonged to elite clothing items. This is shocking for us to kind of contemplate because we always assumed that these kinds of works were the result, and they are to some extent, of a trans-Pacific trade, but that the shells themselves came in as part of that trade as raw material during a colonial period. But what the Metropolitan work is suggesting is that some of these shells might have been repurposed from pre-Hispanic or pre-Columbian elite clothing items. So then it leads us to say, well, if those particular shells that have been repurposed are on particular figures, are they not dressing, these elite Christians now with the same materials that Moctezuma might have worn, or these kind of elite rulers? All questions, very little answers from this point forward, as we'll see. So I mentioned Trans-Pacific Exchange. I want us to kind of briefly look at this map. I know that the scholars here in front are totally used to this map and probably show it to their class as well. It's a very well-used map because what it does, it shows New Spain and Spanish America, which also includes, of course, the Viceroyalty of Peru, and eventually 2 other viceroyalties. It shows us in the middle, not tangential, not peripheral. It is the Americas that make globalization possible, that bring East and West together, right? So you have Spain controlling the Philippines. The Philippines are named after King Philip, right? And so you have their control of the Philippines with Manila as a capital, and they're bringing in goods and items and knowledge, technology, and people from all over Asia through Manila onto the Manila Galleon, coming to the coast of Acapulco, going overland, being reshaped, refashioned, sold, reformed, and made into product, and then traveling, a large number of them, at least, of these objects, traveling to Veracruz. And then Veracruz, of course, will take us back to Spain, to Seville, and vice versa. Right, so this change and exchange was happening with Mexico being a central key, a central element to that globalization. The other thing I want to show us that has to do with cartography is this map. And you, being in New Mexico, are probably well aware that we're part of New Spain. But if you get outside of New Mexico and say go to Oklahoma, then people are less familiar actually with that history. And so you have to show maps such as these to show these territories and the kind of shared geographies that in fact we exist in today. In order to really appreciate those histories, not just as a thing of the past, but as something that guides us actually today in how we educate populations, but also benefit certain populations, or maybe even repair things that were done in the past. So Mexico City is in the center of Mexico, but that route, of course, went north and ended in Santa Fe as a terminus route. Donna Pierce, wonderful scholar, Santa Fe based today, has written a lot on this Trans-Pacific exchange and what it meant for communities here in New Mexico. So we were privy to that exchange here as well. She's gone through wills and inventory lists, and not just museums and not just things that exist today, but records of what existed and what items were given and whatnot. And there is clear evidence that this material coming from Asia through the Philippines, coming through the Manila Galleon onto Acapulco, came up all the way to Santa Fe. Right, so this all has a bearing on this landscape of sanctity. So New Spain isn't just celebrating Saint Ignatius and Santa Teresa, and Saint Isidore. They're also saying we could have our own saints. We want to get in on this game. The Archbishop wants to, the Viceroy wants to, all the bishops and clergy want to, and the mendicant orders, which you'll hear about if you're here for the lecture by Govan Bailey later in this term. So this is important because you have different kind of contingencies within the Viceroyalty who are basically entering this competition with their favored person. So it is about veneration, it is about faith, it is about real admiration for the lives that these figures led and the good deeds and miracles that they performed, but there's also the element of competition. The Franciscans want a saint before the Dominicans, right? Mexico City needs a saint before Puebla, etc. Right? So the competition is within the Viceroyalty. On the left is a beautiful manuscript that has yet to be published. It is absolutely divine because it's fully illustrated. It's from the celebrations that took place regarding Sebastián de Aparicio. Sebastián de Aparicio is a local guy. He died in 1600. He was a Spanish transplant, died and was venerated. He was a Franciscan, so he had the Franciscans really pushing for his canonization. Was he holy? Absolutely, according to his biography. He was charitable, he was giving, he entered the order late in life, got rid of his fortune, which was immense, gave it all to the church. and led not just a pious life, but he was visited by the saints and the Virgin Mary and Christ. Right? So if this is not kind of evidence enough for sanctity, the Franciscans said, we don't know what is. Finally, he was beatified in 1789. So dies in 1600, beatified in 1789. Right? So it gives you an idea of how long these processes could take. And Mexico City celebrated that. Even though he was a kind of favorite son of Puebla, Mexico City got in on the act and had a huge procession and celebration, and this manuscript was produced honoring those activities. And in the center is a beautiful reliquary from the 17th century that uses some illuminated kind of vellum by the Lagarto family, so second decade perhaps of the 17th century, but already there's a space for Sebastián de Aparicio. Sebastián de Aparicio is neither beatified nor a saint at the time that reliquary is made. Right? There's other folks that are mentioned in that reliquary and have cartouches that are local figures that have not been officially recognized by the church. So while I want to stress with the exhibition and with this lecture that Trent matters, there are limits to its reach. Because if Trent is not going to recognize a saint in New Spain, audiences in New Spain aren't simply going to wait around for it. They're going to recognize figures themselves, right, even unofficially. And it's part of the canonization process for sure, but it also gets very kind of dangerously close to subverting it a little bit. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then on the right, you have a relic dedicated to Santa Rosa de Lima. Santa Rosa is the first saint that's canonized in Spanish America, in the Americas, and she is from the Viceroyalty of Peru and not New Spain. She is celebrated in New Spain when this happens, and altars are set up famously in Mexico City's cathedral, but also other churches belonging to the Dominicans especially. And Tepoztlán acquires this beautiful relic because it belonged to a local conventual setting. So a convent had this relic, and eventually it enters the museum in Tepoztlán. Absolutely gorgeous. It's a finger of that saint. Mexico City is a storehouse for the study of sanctity, in fact. This is the cathedral in Mexico City, the Metropolitan Cathedral, and all we have to do is just look at this church in order to get an idea of how dispersed and broad and kind of deep those archives are of material objects and veneration, to give us an idea that saints were everywhere in New Spain. Everyone was venerating saints. Multiple saints belonged to a confraternity in honor of probably multiple saints, right? And so in the cathedral in Mexico, you have a chapel dedicated to relics, to saints. And so you have these beautiful painted panels, and behind them there are little containers, and those will hold the holy. Relics, usually bones belonging to the person that is pictured on the surface. There's one exception that we know of. There is Juan Diego that's unfurling the Virgen de Guadalupe, and that's painted on the outside, and on the inside you have a fragment of the tilma. So it's a relic, but it's not a bodily relic. The relationship between bodily relics and images, especially icons not made of human hands, overlaps a lot in New Spain to a degree that we don't quite see elsewhere, anywhere in the early modern world, I would argue. So it's a perfect case study for looking at those kinds of questions and circumstances. On the right is a more traditional relic in the cathedral, and it is of old saint, obscure saint, but because these relics are in Mexico City, they're incredibly important and incredibly relevant. Relics were positioned in altars like these or in containers, but they were also processed, taken out. If there's a drought, you process relics and images. If you need to be healed, you visit relics, right? If you are having, contractions and it's too early, get thee to a medic, but also to a saint, because you need to touch the miracle, touch the miraculous, be as close as possible in order to feel protected, in a sense. So this is the landscape that we're working with. The cathedral, just in 2017, suffered major damage because of an earthquake. And workers began to renovate, fix, repair different sections of what was damaged in 2017. A little bit late in that year, they discovered something incredibly important. They discovered 23 lead boxes on the base of the drum of the lantern in the cathedral. And each one of these lead boxes is dedicated to a different saint. And it asks that saint to pray, not just for us, but for Mexico City and for the cathedral. And so it's invoking the saint in order to get the protection of that saint. Again, not just as an individual, but a community, as a urban center, as a capital city as well. This find is amazing. We're incredibly grateful to INA and to Sitios y Monumentos, the organization that sent in these workers and conservators, for sharing their data with us as we organized our own show, and for offering some of these images that I'm sharing with you now. Each one of these boxes has material that has fast kind of deteriorated, but some images actually look like they were created just yesterday. So we have San Felipe de Jesus. So San Felipe de Jesus was not a saint at this time, far from it, and he is being invoked here and celebrated as a protector of Mexico City. And why not? He is from Mexico City, and he has been beatified, so good enough. They must have thought he's a saint, as far as we're concerned. And so there's a beautiful image dedicated to him, and then there are also some religious scenes. There's another container that has a little note amongst those 23 containers, and it's a note that's left in the early 19th century, and it's by workers who were repairing the cathedral in that year, and they said, we found this container, and these are the items we found in the container, and this is who the archbishop is, and this is who the viceroy is, and this is the date, and this is who we are. There's about 8 names that are mentioned. And if you find this, please pray for our souls. And after we found this, we put it back and placed it where it belonged. And so in 2019, this container was uncovered, and it was quite special to have this kind of communication, not just with the colonial past from earlier era, but also more recent, kind of early 19th century history as well. So more kind of promotion of local figures. Felipe de Jesus, Sebastián de Aparicio. These 2 figures have a lot in common. They're the only 2 who have been beatified by the time Mexican independence rolls around. So this is the problem we have. We want to study saints in New Spain, and we want to study the saints that were local, that were venerated, that were from Puebla, Querétaro, Zacatecas, Santa Fe, all of these areas, that are kind of local cause celebs, but it's difficult to do so because there's only 2 beatifications in a 300-year period. And so these are it. So the challenge we have is, how do we study sanctity and that kind of sanctity, how people locally were venerating people who walked the streets of their own towns, of their own cities. When the Vatican Archive and the official archives only gives us information for 2 figures. We have to think beyond those archives, essentially. And we're not alone in thinking this, because even if you look at sanctity in Europe, there are folks like Simon Ditchfield and other scholars that are working with Italy and Spain that are doing the same. They're saying, canonization is one thing, but who was beatified? Who was venerated as a servant of God, which is the first step? Who was venerated but didn't quite make it into that first stage? Who's being heard as a cause in this time, in this place, and who's proposing them, and to what extent and to what effect? All of those questions are important, so we're all really busy in our own corner, so to speak, academically, trying to rethink how we study this really important question of sanctity and its construction during this time. There's another challenge for New Spain, however, and that challenge is that these are 2 local figures who don't make beatification, but they are recognized as a servant of God. Palafox on the left, he eventually is beatified. And then we have a nun from Puebla who is a charismatic, whose cause was introduced at the urging of Palafox, who's a bishop in Puebla at the time. And he returns to Spain, but her cause remains, and she is officially investigated. She's known as the Lily of Puebla, and she doesn't quite make it to the next stage. But just the other day, I was reading about all of the organization that's being done by local Catholic communities in Puebla to reignite her cause. And in fact, it's back. And so they are campaigning. There's a big kind of contingency that traveled to Rome and secured an audience with, the new Congregation of Rights, which is actually multiple offices now, in order to get her recognized. So saints still matter for us today, even colonial saints or pseudo-saints, neo-saints, not yet saints. The big challenge for us is that the beatifications that have existed, even the servants of God, which there were 11 in the colonial period, all of those people are folks that are from Spain that made their life in New Spain. So they are all European transplants that lived and worked and gave and died in New Spain and were causes for communities in New Spain. But that in itself kind of doesn't recognize a broader landscape of charismatics and how they were venerated. So the question is particularly difficult for historians of art, because while we have images of Jerónima de la Asunción, a wonderful abbess who travels from Toledo to Seville, Velázquez paints her portrait, gets on a boat, goes to Veracruz, overland to Acapulco, to Manila, establishes the first convent in Manila for Franciscan women, and dies there and is venerated as a saint or someone who could be a saint. Lots of material in the archive related to Jerónima de la Asunción. What do we do with the so-called China Poblana? From Asia, probably enslaved, working in different communities, kind of transgressing boundaries. A very popular person in Puebla for communities of all walks of life, in fact. So the China Poblana is going to be as big as any other person locally, but you could find no other image of her but what I'm showing you up on the screen. So that's the challenge, right? What do we do when we want to deal or interrogate or explore sanctity when it comes to indigenous subjects, Black figures, Asian figures, the marginalized? Because we're not just talking about people who never made it, we're also talking about people who are always suspect. So there is no official push of canonization for these figures. So what does our archive look like then? You know, how much further afield do we have to go, right, from the Vatican archive in order to learn a little bit more about these people? There are only kind of flickers that these folks existed. A holy man in Sonora who was indigenous, a mulata milagrosa in the archive at the AG in Mexico City about a person who's living in Querétaro. An indigenous person who claims to have received the stigmata. There's a page dedicated to that person in the Inquisition archive. The rest of the documents break off, then there is no rest. We can't find them. So there are these suggestions, and so we have to think about what